Welcome to the Modern Mexico podcast. I'm your host, Nathaniel Parish. On the last episode of the Modern Mexico podcast, we spoke to the Council on Foreign Relations' Shannon O'Neill about why Mexico's economy is struggling. On today's episode, we're speaking to historian AS Dillingham about his new book, OAXACA RESURGENT: Indigeneity, Development, and Inequality in 20th-Century Mexico. As Mexico celebrates Day of the Dead, it's a great time to talk about Oaxaca's indigenous history and traditions. Mexico's indigenous communities have been fighting to protect and promote their history, heritage, and homelands for hundreds of years. Day of the Dead is one of many contemporary examples of a pre-Hispanic custom that has been passed through generations, melded with foreign influences, and preserved. Day of the Dead was promoted around the globe in a 2017 film, Coco, which grossed $808 million around the world. Coco introduced Day of the Dead to families around the world, but also reintroduced the tradition in Mexico and gave it new exposure to urban, globally connected families who may have limited ties to Mexico's rural indigenous traditions.
It's Dia de los Muertos. No one's going anywhere. Tonight is about family. Dia de los Muertos is the one night of the year our ancestors can come visit us. We've put their photos on the ofrenda so their spirits can cross over. That is very important. If we don't put them up, they can't come. We made all this food, set out the things they loved in life, mijo. All this work to bring the family together.
In today's episode of the Modern Mexico podcast, we're speaking to Mexico historian AS Dillingham about his new book, OAXACA RESURGENT, and the topic of indigenous identity in modern Mexico. Hi, Shane. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Nate. Great to be here.
So this time of year, we've got the city putting out marigolds all over Mexico City. We have businesses putting up Day of the Dead decorations. So with that in mind, I just wanted to start off the conversation today by asking you if you have a favorite Day of the Dead memory from your time in Mexico.
You are right. I wish I was in Mexico right now. I'm in Philadelphia, and so we have a small ofrenda or altar here in our house that we've just set up. But it is a special time of the year. I think in terms of my favorite memory of Day of the Dead is probably from 2017 when I was living in Oaxaca, and that fall my wife's grandfather had passed away that August, and so during the Day of the Dead we gathered at his grave, and we spent the night there accompanying him in the cemetery. And if for those of the listeners who've been to a cemetery during the Day of the Dead, it's a really special time where families gather, they decorate the graves of their loved ones, they bring food, there's music, there's mariachis, we brought mezcal and pass around mezcal to fellow families and friends. And I think it's a beautiful tradition in a way that a kind of powerful way to celebrate loved ones who've passed on. And and the idea, of course, is that they are still with us. And so that's probably my favorite Day of the Dead memory, although there are many.
Okay, great. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Oaxaca there, because obviously Oaxaca is the focus of your book. And I'm wondering, just kind of generally, what makes Oaxaca so unique, and why did you choose to study Oaxaca?
Right. Yeah, no, Oaxaca, I think, as a state in southern Mexico, is unique and interesting in a number of ways. And so, just in terms of cultural and linguistic diversity, Oaxaca has over 16 officially recognized indigenous languages, and we could list them: Mixtec, Zapotec, Mije, Chatino, the list goes on. And even within those different language groups, there are regionally specific variants, right? So the Zapotec spoken in the valleys is different than the Zapotec spoken on the coast. And you also, in addition to that cultural and linguistic diversity, it is a place of incredible biological diversity, right? So Oaxaca, in a relatively small geographic area, has Central Valley, that's a high altitude Central Valley. It has multiple mountain ranges, including the Sierra Madre del Sur. It has a Pacific coast, as well as a lowland border with the state of Veracruz. And so it's a place of rich biological diversity. One can wake up in the morning in the mountains and, be wearing a sweater and kind of be sitting above the clouds. And by that afternoon, you could be in a tropical climate on the Pacific coast. And so, all those things make it an incredibly unique and interesting place. In addition to that, it has this rich social and political history. And so it was a center of pre-Hispanic population, home to multiple indigenous city-states. And then as Mexico, emerges as a modern nation state, is a place of rich political history in which major Mexican politicians, like the 19th century president Benito Juarez, Porfirio Diaz, we could list many more political figures who have a major role in national politics in Mexico, all start their careers in the state. And so, for those and many other reasons, I think Oaxaca was a place and is a place that's kind of intrinsically fascinating.
Okay, great. So you mentioned, Oaxaca has this very rich and unique language, ecology, geography, history, and politics. And you get into all of that in your book. And I wanted just to ask you, what is the big idea that you want readers to take away from your book?
I think the big idea that I hope readers find when they open the pages of Oaxaca Resurgent is for them to be able to think about this major contradiction or contradictory nature of Mexican politics and society, which is that in the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution of 1910, the state that emerges is a particular state that ends up celebrating kind of officially its indigenous heritage and its indigenous population. And so if listeners have seen the murals of Diego Rivera, painted on public buildings, the National Palace in Mexico, or if you think about the way that the Mexican state celebrates pre-Hispanic ruins like Teotihuacan or Monte Alban in Oaxaca, the state has this official celebration of indigenous peoples and the indigenous past, yet at the same time, the state also has cast living indigenous people as a problem, right? As people who don't speak the national language Spanish, who lack certain modern attributes according to this discourse. And so the Mexican state has this kind of contradictory relationship to its indigenous population. And so in the book, I try to basically examine that contradiction as it plays out in this one particular part of Mexico, the state of Oaxaca.
Okay, great. And with all of that in mind, I'm wondering, in the process of doing your field work and writing the book, who's the most interesting character that really stands out to you?
Yeah, in the course of researching the book, I used both archival sources, that is, materials I found in national and state and local archives, as well as oral histories, right? I interviewed dozens of people involved with indigenous politics and education policy in Oaxaca over the course of the 20th century. And, one of the people that stands out in those interviews that I conducted for the book was a man by the name of Ramon Hernandez Lopez. So Hernandez Lopez was born in 1923. He was born in a highland Mixtec-speaking community in the Mixteca Alta of Oaxaca in the western half of the state near the border with Guerrero. And his town was called San Agustin Tlacotepec. And Hernandez Lopez basically grew up only speaking Mixtec, had to learn Spanish in schools, and became a fairly successful student, and eventually won scholarships to study his secondary and high school educations in Mexico City. And he went on to become a federal school teacher and had a very kind of storied career in the history of Mexican education. And so he was this bilingual federal teacher. He returns to Oaxaca in the 1950s and is involved in a number of education initiatives. He was also sent by Mexico's National Indigenous Development Agency, the Instituto Nacional Indigenista, to spearhead some of its work in the neighboring state of Chiapas. And he eventually returns to where he grew up, the Mixteca Alta, and leads the federal government's efforts to expand education in that highland region. And he heads up an experimental radio school program in which, from a radio station located in the district capital of the Mixteca Alta, Tlaxiaco, he broadcasts Spanish language lessons, but importantly, he used both his native Mixtec as well as Spanish to try to reach listeners and students in the region. And so he has this kind of long career. He ascends through the education bureaucracy in Mexico, and he ends up running a number of important education and development programs. He, for example, was later sent by Alfonso Caso, the head of the Indigenous Development Agency, to Oaxaca's Costa Chica. And there he found himself in confrontations with local caciques, right, kind of regional power brokers, as he tried to create agricultural and land reform. So he's someone whose life trajectory fits nicely in the evolution of Mexican indigenous education and development policy, and kind of cuts an inspiring figure.
Okay, great. And I know in your book you really show that the development of public education in Mexico has this really long and rich history in Mexico. So I had a couple of statistics that I wanted to mention. We know that Mexico's public education system is currently stronger than the systems in most other countries in Latin America, but it sits in last place within the OECD. And when it comes to public education, Mexico is ranked 46th out of 50th in a recent PISA study. So basically what we see is that Mexico has this great history of developing a massive public school system in the 20th century, but the country has really failed to keep up with countries in Asia and Eastern Europe in recent decades. And this is a problem that I think many recent politicians and presidents have struggled to address. So kind of looking back a little bit just to a few years ago, I wanted to ask what former President Enrique Peña Nieto hoped to accomplish with his education reform and how that played out in Oaxaca specifically.
Right. No, that's a great question, Nate. And I think you're right to point to the history of Mexican education as this, in some ways, singular experience in public education in the early part of the 20th century. So one of the major achievements of the post-revolutionary state was the offer to expand public, federal, secular education throughout the rural countryside of Mexico. And so in the 1920s and 1930s, you see this massive expansion of education. I think I should know, just for listeners, part of that expansion involved the expansion of education, not only through the education ministry, but also through the National Teachers Union, which eventually is called the SINTE, or the SNTE. And so the history of the Ministry of Education in Mexico and the history of the SINTE in Mexico are intertwined. In terms of your question about former President Peña Nieto's education reform, I think nominally the way that the Peña Nieto and his administration described it was that this reform would address exactly some of the problems that you just mentioned, that it would improve standards in terms of Mexican education, It would, for example, ask Mexican public school teachers to sit for qualifying exams to basically ensure the quality of teacher preparation. So there were these proposed tests for teachers. It also did aim to wrest away control from the National Teachers Union, which had, over the years, been able to control certain segments of the Ministry of Education's administrative kind of functions. So it was a union that at times, if for English language speakers, you might call a kind of closed shop union. And so all of Peña Nieto's reforms were in part aimed at trying to wrest control from the CENTE national leadership. They also said that there was corruption within the union and within the education ministry. They gave examples of, teachers being on the books who weren't actually teaching classes, these kind of quote unquote ghost teachers. And so all of Peña Nieto's education reform was directed ostensibly at these problems. Critics, and I would agree with a lot of these criticisms, argued that Peña Nieto's reforms were really a kind of top-down reform that was more rhetoric than substantive policy. They pointed out that there was plenty of corruption within the Ministry of Education itself. Peña Nieto's Ministry of Education, for example, was spending more money on their media campaigns than they were on proper teacher training. And that was happening while, schools in regions such as Oaxaca, if one were to visit them, people would, I think, be shocked by the lack of basic school infrastructure, school buildings, school supplies, etc. And so that was Peña Nieto's kind of aim, but he was confronted, I think, quite forcefully by both the National Teachers Union as well as the dissident current within the Teachers Union, which is the national coordinator of teachers. Both those sectors within the education system fought back and resisted those reforms over a number of years.
Okay, and with all of that in mind, what differences do we see during the current administration? What has President AMLO done regarding education reform?
Right. So López Obrador, the current president of Mexico, he came into office with the explicit promise to withdraw Peña Nieto's reforms, right, which had kind of stalled out for all intents and purposes. And so López Obrador explicitly sought to halt his predecessor's reforms. I think we can't really talk about López Obrador's relationship to education policy without describing the way that the pandemic has affected education over the last few years in Mexico. So Mexican schools, like many places around the world, were shut down during the pandemic. There was a shift to online education. Kind of the government's policy was a learn from home policy. And, that, like in many places, has resulted in a real loss in terms of educational culture and practices over the last couple of years. So, when I was in Oaxaca last year, I was in a small rural town in the mountains, and you would see junior high school students standing on a hilltop with their cell phones trying to connect to their online class, right, with weak internet signals, etc. And so, I think most of the problems that we're seeing in Mexican education right now under the López Obrador administration are tied up to this very challenging question of the pandemic. There have been fights over reopening the schools, with the teachers union opposing some of the reopenings. But now here, just in the last few months, we have seen a significant sector of the education system open up. And I think the other thing that's worth mentioning, just because we're talking about López Obrador's relationship to education, he has, in many ways, been engaged in an attack on higher education. That is the national university in Mexico, the UNAM. And so you've seen López Obrador, I think in strange ways, kind of casting about, criticizing institutions of higher education in Mexico, trying to limit their budgets, limit research budgets, etc., all in the name of maybe fighting corruption or austerity. But I think this is having really negative effects on the quality and capacity of higher education in Mexico.
Okay, interesting. And I know that at the local level in different industrial cities in Mexico, we have politicians that are wondering about the future of manufacturing and what's happening with um, high-tech manufacturing, the Internet of Things, Industry 4.0, all of these things. And they're wondering about how they can prepare their young people for the industry of the future. And I'm wondering, is that something that you hear AMLO talking about at all? Is kind of innovation and like a high-tech future at all part of his discourse related to education, or is that not something that you've heard him speak a lot about?
No, I mean, I think, unfortunately, the president's rhetoric around education has not gotten to that level of sophistication. I don't think he's really invested in thinking about innovative approaches to education or the questions of, say, science and math instruction that you're alluding to. I think where we do see people talking about that is in the nonprofit sector, right? So you have education-related NGOs and nonprofits that are trying to push forward some alternative models. But in terms of the leadership from the presidential administration, I don't see much interesting language coming from there.
Okay, interesting. So going back a little bit to Mexico's recent past, I remember when I was working on the Oaxaca chapter of my book, I attended a teachers' protest in the state capital in Oaxaca. And I remember seeing, this group of thousands of teachers approaching a group of thousands of police in riot gear. And at a certain point, some of the teachers started hurling mango-sized rocks into the group of police, and the police fired tear gas canisters into the crowd. And I think within Mexico, probably more than any other union in the country, teachers' unions in particular have a reputation for being militant and sometimes violent. And I'm wondering if you've attended any more recent protests in Oaxaca or in Mexico City.
No, you're right. I think education activism and teacher protests and teacher strikes are a major part of Mexican politics, and indeed in the state of Oaxaca are one of the central cleavages of Oaxacan politics. And so in many ways, the way that I came to write my book, Oaxaca Resurgent, started with a teacher strike in 2006. So in 2006, Oaxacan teachers, led by Section 22 of the National Union, struck on May 1st. And Oaxacan teachers had been striking basically annually on May 1st, International Workers' Day, for over 20 years. It started in 1980. And that strike by 2006 had become somewhat of a routine affair, right? Every May 1st, they would go on strike. They would enter into negotiations with the governor and federal authorities, and they would reach some kind of settlement. But in 2006, the strike became historic precisely because it didn't follow that routine. So the governor at the time, who was a member of the ruling party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI, Ulises Ruiz Ortiz, instead of negotiate with the teachers, he sent in riot police, baton-wielding riot police who attacked the teachers' encampment. You had police in helicopters shooting tear gas above the city center. And that government repression basically turned that annual teacher strike into a massive social movement. So over the course of 2006, and I was there studying as a graduate student, one saw the teachers' movement in Oaxaca seize control of the state capital. Basically, police, you would see no federal or local police within the center of the state capital. Teachers ran it. Some supporters of the teachers movement called it the Oaxacan Commune, making comparisons to the Paris Commune. And you saw this major development of a social movement in which teachers and their allies blocked roads, obviously marched through the streets. You had marches of over 100, 200,000 people, which is a very large march for a state of Oaxaca, which has just a few million people in terms of total population. And the goal of that movement was to get rid of the governor, right? Was to not just transform from a strike to a political movement to get the governor to resign. And the way politically you can get the governor to resign is if the state is declared ungovernable. And so in 2006, when you're alluding to some of the major street conflicts or violence, the goal of the teachers movement was to make the state ungovernable. So it would trigger a state constitutional crisis and the resignation of the governor. They weren't successful in that because eventually, through a negotiated settlement with the federal authorities, federal police, which would now be the Guardia Nacional in Mexico, were brought in and the movement was put down. That, I think, is probably the biggest, most explosive teacher protest I've seen in recent years in Mexico.
Okay, great. And I know that in general in Mexico, when we think about teachers' unions, we think about corruption at the top level. And I remember a few years ago there was a well-known union leader who was arrested, and news stories came out about all of the designer clothing that she owned and the properties that she owned in Mexico and in the U.S. And that was kind of like a symbol for the corruption within the union. But that's at the national level. And I'm wondering, how important is that corruption at the local level in Oaxaca, and how does it play out or affect people's lives at the local level in Oaxaca?
Right. No, I think that's a great point. And, you're referring to Elber Esther Gordillo, right? Or the maestra, and who was, her kind of flagrant corruption, her fancy clothes, her houses in fancy neighborhoods in Mexico City and San Diego were, just egregious signs of the corruption in the national union. And she eventually found herself arrested for some of that. I think in terms of Oaxaca and teachers organizing in Oaxaca, for much of the last 2 decades of the 20th century, Oaxacan teachers were part of a dissident movement within the national union that was aimed at confronting that corruption and undemocratic control of the Cente, right? And so Elba Esther Gordillo and these other corrupt leaders were part of a current within the National Teachers Union called Vanguardia Nacional, which was a current connected to the ruling party. And so that corrupt union leadership found alliances with politicians and actually kind of went back and forth in terms of holding political office and then holding trade union offices. And so many teachers in Mexico, particularly teachers in southern Mexico, teachers in indigenous regions, in the late 1970s and then even more forcefully in the 1980s, sought to confront that corrupt, undemocratic leadership by wresting control of their union locals from the national leadership in the Vanguardia Revolucionaria. And so in Oaxaca, that struggle is taking place throughout the 1980s, and they do eventually democratize Section 22, that is the Oaxacan local of the teachers union. And so they are able to democratize their own union local and get rid of some of this corrupt leadership. But the corrupt leadership remains at the national level, right? And La Maestra, or the union leader that you mentioned, would be a good example of that. And so there was this historic struggle, that was successful. But I think today, you could probably point to continued problems within the education sector in Oaxaca, in which, for example, education budgets have often been used as basically political slush funds for state governors, right? And so the governors of Oaxaca in the last few decades often basically took money out of education budgets to use at their pleasure. And so there's still, I think, a struggle for accountability and transparency at the local level.
Okay, and I remember that a few years ago during the height of the protests in Oaxaca against the education reform, I saw a poll that said 9 out of 10 residents opposed the hardline tactics of the union members, including, blockades and sometimes violent marches and fights with police and things like that. And I'm wondering, what is the relationship right now between Oaxaca's residents and teachers' unions? Is there still frustration with the strikes and with some of the more violent tactics, or is there also somewhat of an understanding that this isn't a problem just about teachers' unions, that in Mexico in general, the state is weak and rule of law is limited, and actors in a variety of sectors sometimes have to use violent tactics to achieve their means, their goals. And so I'm just wondering, overall, is there some understanding of why teachers are using these tactics, or is there kind of more frustration with the disruptions which do happen,
Right.
which do happen if you're living in Oaxaca City and you have to deal with blockades and protest marches?
Yeah, no, I mean, your comment I think is really important, Nate. When I was living in Oaxaca a few years ago, a neighbor of mine described Oaxaca City as La Ciudad Tomada, right? Which would translate as, he said it was the Ciudad Borracha, porque siempre está tomada, right? That it is the drunk city because it's always taken or seized, right? It's a kind of play on the Spanish. But in the sense that, Oaxaca City is oftentimes paralyzed by strikes and protests. And so for city residents, this is a major nuisance, right? And it is a source of endless frustration. And so I certainly think that there is that sentiment, lots of frustration with the tactics and the effects on third parties when there are these strikes and protests, not just of Oaxacan teachers, but of other sectors of Oaxacan society. But at the same time, as you allude to, many people in Oaxaca have teachers as part of their family, right? The Oaxacan teachers are the largest sector of the, formal employment in the state. The Oaxacan Teachers Union is the largest trade union in the state. Oaxaca is still today a relatively rural place, doesn't have a large industrial sector. And so the Teachers Union is kind of the major political voice outside of the governor's office, right? And so in 2006, the teachers union could serve as a kind of rallying point to try to affect change. And I think, as you point to, one of the problems with the teachers movement or the education sector in Oaxaca is you can't really separate it from this context of rural poverty and lack of economic opportunity. And so the teachers movement, the positions as within the education sector are highly coveted in a place where there's few employment opportunities. And I think, as you suggested, the last thing to say about it would be, in Oaxaca and in Mexico more broadly, you have a lack of functioning state institutions. You have a lack of enforced regulations and federal or local policies. And so what people find is that the way that they achieve higher wages or better job protections is through basically social protest and social mobilization. And so there's a long history of that in Mexico. But today, even if you see, we think about struggles around femicides, right, or violence against women, we don't see Mexican institutions taking the steps necessary. And what we do see is Mexican civil society and feminists and other activists waging, struggles in the streets to try to affect change. And so I think plenty of Oaxacans, and I don't want to speak for all of society, but I think plenty of people in Oaxaca understand those contradictions, right? That while there are these frustrations about teacher strategies and the way that they affect the rest of Oaxacan life, I think they're also an understanding that there are very few other institutional avenues to affect change. And so part of this is a reflection of that broader institutional lack of capacity.
Okay, so, it's a very complicated movement that's taking place within an immensely complex social and political context. But exactly. I'm wondering if we can just sum up a little bit. And if you had to pick just 3 words to describe Oaxaca's teachers unions, what 3 words would you choose?
All right. right. I'll give it a try. I think the three words when I think about Oaxaca's teachers movement is dissident, mobilized, and equality, right? Because this is a historically dissident teachers movement. It's a movement that has used social mobilization. And I think oftentimes the fights over Oaxacan education are fights about equity and equality.
Okay, interesting. If I had to pick three words, I probably would pick indigenous to be to be one of the words.
Yeah.
But that leads me into my next question, which is Mexico's current president, López Obrador, really loves to use indigenous symbols and indigenous clothing, but some of his development plans have also been met with resistance from indigenous communities. And you talk about this idea that during Mexico's modern era of economic development, the concept of modernity really meant integration with the global economy. But in practice, it also meant trying to erase indigenous identity. So within that context, I'm wondering, what is AMLO's relationship like with Oaxaca's indigenous communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you are correct in that the president often invokes, right, we're commemorating the 500th anniversary of the fall of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, and in the process of the Spanish conquest. And so we're commemorating that anniversary. The president's administration has organized a series of events to do that, and describing it as 500 years of indigenous resistance. So there's a way, I think, that López Obrador kind of wraps himself in the symbolism of Mexico's indigenous peoples. I think in terms of his relationship to indigenous communities in Oaxaca, I would describe it as, probably at best a kind of, rhetorical or superficial celebration of those communities, rather than a kind of deep connection with them. We could think about the different major initiatives that his administration is putting forward, whether it's the Tren Maya or the efforts to connect the Oaxacan Isthmus, on both sides of the Atlantic and the Pacific. These are initiatives that involve no consultation with the indigenous communities that they would affect, and are, really about, kind of this model of economics that is focused on macroeconomic growth, on big federal investments that I don't think really reckon with the reality of indigenous communities, particularly in the South.
Okay, great. So kind of if we can play the same game here, can you try to sum up AMLO's relationship with Mexico's indigenous communities in just three words?
Sure, yeah. I think, and that one maybe is easier to, I think AMLO's relationship to indigenous communities could easily be described as rhetorical, paternalistic, and folkloric, right? And I could elaborate on why I think that, but I think that he stands in a long tradition of Mexican politicians who don indigenous, dress or make superficial references to indigenous communities, while doing little, I think, to respectfully engage with those communities, their political traditions or cultural knowledge.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is kind of why it's so important to look back at the history and understand, how the present relates to history, because AMLO insists that he's a complete break from Mexico's corrupt and unfair past, where only elites benefited and indigenous communities were left out. But really, we see a lot of parallels between his rhetoric and his actions and, presidents from the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. So maybe rather than being a complete break with the past, it's just a return to an earlier model. But it's also a model that, many people at the local level in Oaxaca might be frustrated with and might not be completely on board with. I know that in the Oaxaca chapter of my book, I focused on a town that has a group of master mezcal makers who created a bilingual school for their kids, but right now are caught up between wanting to preserve their language and their indigenous traditions, but also wanting to prepare their kids to study English and find success outside of their towns and to integrate with the global economy. And I'm wondering if this conflict between preserving traditions and preparing for the future is something you've seen in Oaxaca.
Right. No, I mean, I think your chapter on Oaxaca does get at this long-standing dilemma, which is a dilemma, I should say, that indigenous people, I think, are faced with in an unfair and long-standing way, which is for indigenous people to participate in the economy, in politics, in education, in modern life. They were asked to shed an important part of themselves, which is their indigenous language or cultural practices, right? And so much of Mexican history was, in Mexican federal policy, basically said as much, right? You need to stop speaking your indigenous language. There were education models that used corporal punishment against those who spoke their native languages in the classroom. And you need to become modern Mexicans or modern campesinos, right? Which would be a political category that was important in post-revolutionary Mexico. And so that, dilemma that indigenous Mexicans face is one that continues to exist today, in which communities are both trying to valorize and preserve particularly indigenous languages that have fewer and fewer speakers, but at the same time reckoning with the reality that they need to navigate an economy and a political system in which Spanish and increasingly English are the languages of commerce and power. And so, I, for example, as I studied the history of efforts at kind of bilingual instruction in Mexico, that were these reformist efforts, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, there were many indigenous teachers and communities who were in favor of bilingual instruction in their native language. But there were always, of course, sectors of those communities that were concerned with their children speaking Spanish well, right? Speaking Spanish without an accent in order to avoid being discriminated against. And of course, today, the parallel would be, as you narrate in your chapter, those people who are involved in the mezcal industry or other economic activities in which English is increasingly important, right? And of course, English is being introduced through long-standing migration patterns in Oaxaca. And so there is a basically Oaxacan diaspora today that, works outside of Oaxaca, in Mexico City, in northern Mexico, in commercial agriculture, and of course in the United States. And so many of the communities that I was doing research in, I would run into youth who might speak Mixtec because they speak Mixtec with their family, and then they spoke English because they had gone to school in Southern California and learned English in schools, and some of them didn't speak much Spanish. And so these were these interesting children, right, who were Mexican citizens, who spoke Mixtec and spoke English and had almost, basically skipped the national language, right? Which I think speaks to this complicated reality of people trying to navigate an increasingly globalized world and having, feet in indigenous speaking communities as well as an international economy.
Okay, so I know that, today you've talked about kind of Oaxaca's unique cultural history and unique geography, but I think that both of those factors are really important for understanding, why it's so difficult to build a high-quality public education system in the state. So I just wanted to mention a couple of statistics. Overall, we know that fewer than 1 in 5 young people in Oaxaca enroll in tertiary education, and that's about half the rate that's found in Mexico City or Nuevo Leon. And right now, illiteracy is almost 12% in Oaxaca versus just 2% in Mexico City or Nuevo Leon. And overall, Oaxaca has the second highest illiteracy rate in Mexico, and it trails only Chiapas in that metric. So I think it is safe to say that the state's remote and rugged terrain poses challenges for schools. We know that the population is very spread out among small hamlets in mountainous areas, and that kind of bucks the global trend towards urbanization. And so when I was working on my book, I found that there are more than 5,600 primary schools in Oaxaca that serve just 500,000 students. So there's an interesting comparison that we can make to the US, which is that Oaxaca's population of school children is about the same as the state of Connecticut, but it has 5 times as many schools as Connecticut does. So for policymakers, I think that creates immense challenges. How do you ensure that this massive number of schools can guarantee high quality elementary and high school education when there aren't really the same economies of scale that exist in more urbanized states? And you just mentioned the example of how there are some communities that will speak an indigenous language and also English because they've chosen to leave their community, go to the U.S., come back, and now they speak English and a local language, but not Spanish. And I think that historically, Mexico's economic development model has favored the North and kind of ignored the South. And maybe the accident by design there is that a lot of people will choose to leave states like Chiapas and Oaxaca and either move to northern Mexican states and work in industry, or move to California, other states in the U.S. And in your book, you mentioned that there were policymakers in Mexico 50 years ago who were excited about migration because they saw it as a modernizing force that would kind of break people out of their isolated communities. So I'm wondering, in 2021 and beyond, as a policy choice, decisions have to be made about investing resources in rural education or improving the quality of urban education to prepare young people in cities for the manufacturing and service jobs of the future. And so with that in mind, I'm wondering, what's the future for public education in Oaxaca? Do you think that policymakers are in fact going to favor urban education over investing in rural schools?
Right. No, yeah, you raise a number of really important dynamics there in your question, Nate. I mean, I think, the education statistics that you mentioned for Oaxaca in terms of, large-scale illiteracy and, lack of access to higher education, I think all of that is true, unfortunately. I think for me, you can't really separate that from what you mentioned, which is the large-scale poverty and lack of economic opportunity in Oaxaca. And so I think it would be a mistake to think that somehow we are going to develop the most, the perfect educational solution to a problem that is also fundamentally an economic and a political problem. And as you said, over the course of the 20th century, Oaxaca, which had at one point been a center of Spanish colonial wealth and a major hub of indigenous civilization, in the 20th century, Mexico chooses an economic model that favors industrialization and urbanization, and in particular, in the second half of the 20th century, commercial agriculture, which is primarily located in northern Mexico. And so, as you mentioned, right, and so you see, the effects of the Green Revolution, this, advent of, large-scale commercial agriculture based on monocultures, chemical fertilizers, explode in northern Mexico in places like Sonora, Sinaloa, Baja California, in other states. And that is taking place through large-scale federal investment, infrastructure projects, irrigation projects to bring water into arid areas. And I think the other reason that Mexico chooses that model of economic development is, of course, proximity to U.S. markets. And so if you have commercial agriculture set up in Baja California or other northern states, within a number of hours, those commodities are sitting on U.S. Supermarket shelves. Oaxaca, because of its geographic position and also because of its topography that you mentioned, is not a prime candidate for large-scale commercial agriculture. And so rather than experiencing Mexican macroeconomic growth in the 20th century as a positive, in many ways, Oaxaca suffers at mid-century as industrial produced goods that are coming from Mexico City or places like Puebla enter Oaxaca and undermine local industries. And Oaxacans themselves, because of basically an increasing dependence on a cash economy, find themselves working outside of the state, right? So a large portion of Oaxaca's population now works outside of the state. And so, I don't think we can ask education policy alone to solve that structural inequality. But I do think we can ask education policymakers to take seriously the realities of education in Oaxaca. There are a large number of schools, as you mentioned, but the quality of those schools are quite poor. And so thinking about how to restructure those schools to offer education to the populations that exist. But I think you also have to think about what are the economic opportunities that are going to keep people in those communities. Because increasingly, if you visit certain communities, and I know you have, there'll be these basically ghost towns where you have the elderly and you'll have some young children, and most working age adults have traveled outside of their community to find wage labor domestically or abroad. And so I think for education policy in the future, I think we have to think in innovative ways. And there are Oaxacan teachers, there's a group of teachers that I have collaborated with, the Coalition of Indigenous Teachers of Oaxaca, or the CIMPIO in Spanish. They have, I think, very interesting proposals to try to transform Oaxacan education to be more engaging, to include community participation, to reckon with the reality of outmigration. And so I think, policymakers, there needs to be reform at the top in terms of the Ministry of Education, but there also needs to be a communication between teachers on the ground who know their communities and know their needs and federal decision making.
Okay, great. So a lot of the conversation today has focused on kind of this relationship between, local traditions and local identities and global trends and global identities. And we also started off the conversation by talking about Day of the Dead. And I just wanted to loop back to that a little bit. So I remember a few years ago, we started seeing some changes in the way that Day of the Dead is celebrated in Mexico, and honestly, a lot of it had to do with two Hollywood movies.
Yep, you're right.
There's a James Bond movie that came out that had a Day of the Dead parade, which is then an idea that Mexico City's government copied and created, and now it's a very fun, a fun tradition that people enjoy celebrating. And then the movie Coco came out, and I think that Coco introduced the concept of Day in the Dead to audiences in the US and countries around the world, but it also reintroduced Day of the Dead to kind of more globally connected urban communities in Mexico, where maybe there are families who speak Spanish and who speak English and who travel to the US and who travel to Europe, but don't really have much connection to indigenous Mexico. And Coco for them was a way to kind of reconnect with some, uniquely Mexican traditions. And with that in mind, I'm wondering, how do you see Day of the Dead fitting into this broader conversation about preserving, celebrating, and also discriminating against indigenous culture and indigenous identity in modern Mexico?
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a really thoughtful commentary and question, Nate, and it raises important and complicated issues about, Mexican national politics, about the kind of commodification of indigenous cultural practices, who and how do we celebrate these things? On one level, I think that in the example of Coco, I have family in Oaxaca who, enjoy the film, some who criticize the film. I think that on one level, I think that people learning about indigenous cultural traditions, even if it's mediated through a Disney film, can be a productive thing. And I, in some ways, happy that more people understand what Day of the Dead is. I think, like any cultural practice, it can be commodified, right? It can be used in a way that's sold for profit, that is taken outside of its original cultural context. And I think that's why some people and critics view Day of the Dead celebrations that were introduced, by the James Bond film recorded there in Mexico City. I think they're, understandably critical of that. I think that it's worth people thinking about if their experience with Day of the Dead and learning about Day of the Dead allows them to come closer to understanding how indigenous peoples have understood death and understood our relationship to death. I think that is something that is positive, right? I think one thing to think about is that indigenous ways of being in the world are one way of making, and I say something to this effect in the book, they're one way of making the past speak to the present, one way of thinking about what is our relationship to the past. And so, what I would want to see is that people respectfully engage with indigenous cultural knowledge and are open to learning from it, right? But I think it's always going to be a messy process in which, Hollywood or government agencies are engaged in this, for their own ends. But I think for me, what is exciting about Day of the Dead and projects of indigenous cultural revitalization is it's a way for us to think about our relationship to the world and relationship to each other in radically different ways. And in Oaxaca, I think one of the things that Oaxaca offers to the world is to think about the way that we are connected to each other and connected to the land or connected to nature, right? That we are involved in reciprocal relationships. And I think, all of Mexican society and global society could learn something from those types of cultural values.
I'd like to take a short break to remind listeners that the Modern Mexico podcast is sponsored by the El Deposito chain of craft beer stores. Visitors and residents in Mexico City and Guadalajara can stop by one of El Deposito's locations and try a wide selection of independently owned beers, including Minerva, Loba, and Calavera. Overall, craft beer still only accounts for around 1% of Mexico's beer market, but many of the brands at El Deposito are carving out a niche for themselves within Mexico. For craft beer aficionados, the best place to sample Mexico's celebrated cervezas artesanales is El Deposito. I just wanted to close out the conversation today by asking a couple of quick, fun questions. And the first one is, what's your favorite cantina in Mexico?
Yeah, no, I have spent a decent amount of time in Mexican cantinas. There's lots probably to explore. My favorite cantina is a cantina that is located in the Zapotec town of Tlacalula, which is just about half hour east of Oaxaca City. And I imagine you've probably visited there, Nate, but it's a Zapotec community that's famous for its weekend markets that draws in other outlying Zapotec towns from around the Central Valleys. And there's a cantina there near the market that has lovely local mezcal, local musicians playing, and you see the vendors who've come in from the outlying communities. Once they've sold their goods in the morning, they come into the cantina in the afternoon for a drink or two before heading home. That's probably my favorite. I would hesitate to give listeners the name of that cantina because I selfishly want to protect it just for myself. But that's probably my favorite cantina. The cantina's in Tlacalula, and so if listeners visit there, just take a stroll through the city center and you'll probably stumble on a number of interesting places.
Okay, great. So a little bit of a scavenger hunt for for anyone
Exactly.
who visits Oaxaca.
Yeah.
And then the next question is what is your favorite cafe that you visited in Mexico?
Well, there's plenty of those as well, and of course, Mexico is a great producer of coffee. I did, as I was living and researching and writing in Oaxaca City, I spent a lot of time at the Centro Cultural San Pablo, which is a cultural center located in downtown Oaxaca City that involves a refurbished 16th century Dominican church, right? And so this private foundation refurbished and renovated this church. And so it's now a research library. It includes a beautiful patio and a coffee shop overlooking this patio. And so I spent many afternoons writing and enjoying a coffee there at the Centro Cultural San Pablo.
Okay, great. And then finally, obviously Mexico is a country that has so much to offer visitors, who want to visit different parts of the country. But I'm wondering, for you, what is the favorite sight or sound that stands out to you from your time in Mexico?
Yeah, I think Mexico is a place of many beautiful sights and sounds and smells. It is I think a place of that is, of course, what attracted me to write a book about Mexico and Oaxaca in particular. I think the image that I am most struck by, or that stands in my memory, is if people visit Oaxaca City, if you arrive or depart from Oaxaca City, which is a city located in a highland Central Valley, you will see the ruins of Monte Alban, this Zapotec city-state that dominated the valleys prior to Spanish arrival. And so if you are leaving or arriving in a plane to Oaxaca City, you see the ruins of Monte Alban, which are on a mountain ridge about 500 meters above the valley floor. And so you see the relationship between the modern state capital of Oaxaca City and these ancient Zapotec ruins. And there's something about, their proximity, right? And as the city has expanded and grown over recent decades, this modern city is encroaching upon these ancient ruins. And that contrast between this ancient past and the kind of bustling contemporary capital is one that always stays with me.
Okay, great. Well, I just wanted to say, I'm looking at the cover of your book right now. I know that the title is Oaxaca Resurgent, Indigeneity, Development, and Inequality in 20th Century Mexico. And I remember when I received it in the mail and I looked at the cover, I was really expecting to engage with, a very academic and challenging text. And I was really pleasantly surprised to find, how engaging, interesting, and fun your book was to read. I think that you put a lot of effort into writing the book in a way that is, kind of easy to absorb and will be engaging to a much broader audience than just, kind of like a small academic niche. So again, I just want to say how much I enjoyed your book, and I just wanted to thank you so much for joining us on the Modern Mexico podcast.
Thank you, Nate. I appreciate your questions and your thoughtful comments.
I'd like to take a minute to remind listeners that the Modern Mexico podcast is sponsored by the Distrito Fijo Cycling Club in Mexico City. It's really important for tourists to understand the local dynamics in the places in Mexico they want to visit. And one of the best ways to explore Mexico is on two wheels. So to meet local cyclists, to have an espresso or a meal, or to join in on an early morning group ride, stop by Distrito Fijo's clubhouse and cycling store in the trendy Colonia Juarez neighborhood in Mexico City. In today's episode, we talked about the state of Oaxaca. Distrito Fijo can help residents and visitors organize multi-day road and gravel cycling vacations in Oaxaca, Chiapas, Jalisco, and other states in Mexico. On that note, we can wrap up this episode of the Modern Mexico podcast. If you haven't already checked it out, listen to the last episode of the podcast where we speak to Mexico expert Shannon O'Neill about Mexico's economic problems and why she gives President López Obrador a failing grade for his economic stewardship. Thanks again for tuning in to the Modern Mexico podcast. The next episode is coming soon. Until then, hasta luego, amigos.